Welcome to the Steve Noble Podcast. Tons of truth, lots of grace, but no sacred cows. Now, let the show begin.
Welcome back, everybody. It's great to be with you once again. We will be pretty much right in the center of my wheelhouse, things that I've been thinking about and talking about and teaching in the classroom through Noble U, talking about, especially to young Christians. They're growing up in a very different world than I grew up in and my guests grew up in, and they really don't know what to do. We are used to a world that, if you go back to when I was in high school, we didn't really think about a culture war in 1980. Of course, I was 14 or 15, but by the time you get to the 90s, we're full in. And that's exactly what I got involved when I became a Christian political activist in 2004. It was all about the culture war. And we had a lot of help, not just here in Raleigh, North Carolina, but across the state, indeed across the country. I would go up to Washington, D.C. once a month to the Arlington group, which were all the pro-family Christian groups around the country. And we would come together at the headquarters for Family Research Council and plot what was going on around the country with some of the big issues like life and marriage and a few other things. And even then, when that started, 2005, 2006, there was a lot of momentum. But fast forward 15 years, America is a very different place with respect to Christianity. And so we're going to talk about that. I've been on a journey reading a lot of different books relative to this whole thought of living in an America that isn't the America that we grew up in, and nor is it the America that we've seen really for the last 400 years. As we've moved by way of Canada, we've moved by way of Europe, moving into a post-Christian world. And what does that look like? How do you live that out? And so in one of my recent interviews, I was talking to Preston Sprinkle. The book is called Exiles, The Church in the Shadow of Empire, which is how do you live as a Christian in any country you find yourselves in? Of course, we all think in terms of America, but anywhere you go. Which then led me to my guest today, Renn, Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture, which really, Aaron, jumped off of an article that you wrote just a couple years ago in First Things called The Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. And so we're going to unpack this today. Aaron is a consultant and a writer. He's back in the Midwest, where I'm from, in Indianapolis, a senior fellow at American Reformer, a former senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. You spent, how long were you in Manhattan, Aaron?
I was 5 years in Manhattan.
5 years in Manhattan, a former partner at Accenture. I have a really good friend that works there now. Has written extensively on cities. I've turned my son onto you because he's lives in San Francisco, and he loves the whole dynamic of Christianity in a large city, culture, the future of evangelical church, as well as men's issues. And it's great to have you on, Aaron. Thanks for your time. What kind of got this kicked off for you? I mean, the article in First Things a couple years ago and then writing the book, but what was kind of stirring that got you to that point?
It actually started back in 2014, shortly before I moved to New York. I spent a year here in Indianapolis, and I went to see a series of Christian short films that my friend had been involved in making. And I was kind of worried that they were going to be amateurish and not well done, but they turned out to be excellent. I mean, the production values were excellent. They were really great films. But I remember thinking to myself, the world that this film is addressing is going to be fading away, and the cultural environment is going to shift such that this is going to be not relevant in the future. So I went home, opened my laptop, entered a whole bunch of bullet points, and that was the genesis of my three worlds model. Then fast forward to 2017, I'd actually started a newsletter about really more oriented towards men's issues in the church, which is still what I do a lot of work on. It's like, why are all these young men turning to online influencers, but not to the church? It's a bigger problem now than it was a decade ago when I started looking into it. But I put this article in there in newsletter number 13, basically a year in. It's called The Lost World of American Evangelicalism. And it went viral then. It was super popular then. In fact, it's what put me on the map. I was actually going to shut the newsletter down because nobody was reading it. And then this article came out, and I ended up with thousands of subscribers. Then First Things asked me to update it it was in the February 2022 issue. And then, of course, the book, which, has the latest version of the model as well as how to live in it. So I'd basically been, I'm sort of a cultural critic. I mean, part of my writing about cities, about society, A lot of it is about sort of diagnosing the culture, seeing what's going on, looking at the trends.
Yeah.
That's true for a lot of things. And so it's always been an interest of mine. And, again, back it was 2014, I really started seeing things changing in America. And that's where the genesis was.
It was probably back around then, and we're talking to Aaron Renn. Life in the Negative World is the book. You can see it in my hot little hands here on Rumble and YouTube. And if you're listening to the regular podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google, wherever you listen, you can Google it. You can also go to Aaron's website, Aaron Renn. That's AARONRENN, AaronRenn.com. Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture, which is what I really want to lean into, the whole anti-Christian culture part. But you're talking about those films in 2014 that you saw, Aaron. Were you thinking, okay, these are films made by Christians, and I'm always worried about that as well. I have a lot of good friends in the Christian film world. Thankfully, praise the Lord, it's gotten a lot better. But was it kind of like these guys are making a film and speaking a language and looking at a culture that literally doesn't exist anymore? Was that kind of the cognitive dissonance that was going on there?
I would say it was sort of oriented around what I call in the book the cultural engagement model. So, of course, I saw it at a Christian college at Indiana Wesleyan. But sort of the Christian college town, kind of urban church movement. The idea is, what is our salvation for? It would talk about vocation. It would talk about like loving your neighbor, various things of that nature. And it was sort of predicated on this, idea that like Christianity in the public square was still sort of a thing you could have. We weren't necessarily in a Christian dominant society anymore, but like the idea that you would just authentically live it out in these various ways. There were like 7 different topics. I don't remember what they all were, but that was a sort of thing. You think about like, faith and work, you could think of being a topic, showing love and, and marriage and those kinds of things. And again, some of it's still relevant. Not saying it was even bad at the time, but like, it was just not talking about like, the issues that I think are dominant in the culture today.
Yeah. And then looking at, hey, faith in the workplace, that's awesome. But faith in the workplace, when most of the people in the workplace are against you, is a whole different level. This probably back around the same time, Aaron, really good friend of mine, pastor, large black church here in the Raleigh area, super conservative, Bishop Wooden. We did a show. I literally titled the show, Teach Me How to Live as a Minority, since I just figured out I am one. And that started in 2004 when we started getting involved, and I would start doing more research and Barna makes money selling bad news, but there's a lot of good information there. And I was shocked to find out that despite the fact that even today, you've got 69% of Americans will self-identify as Christians. When you really start getting down into the nitty gritty, you scratch the surface. What does it take to be a Christian? What do they even have a biblical worldview? Now you're down to, at best case, 13%, probably 9%, maybe even closer to 6%, where you have authentic, born-again, spirit-filled, biblical Christians. And I just didn't realize what a small percentage of the culture we actually are. So that was a real eye-opener, just to begin to think like that. And anecdotally, I think we all realize that's true. We don't know how much the country has changed in terms of how negative is it towards us on a scale from 1 to 10. But in the book, and Life in the Negative World, you look back over the last 60 years and split it into 3 different kind of zones and environments that we were living in America. The first one being when it was kind of positive, which I would say goes all the way back to Plymouth in 1620. But take us through these 3, because this is more recent history, 60 years. Take us through these 3 zones so that people can understand, where were we, then what happened, and then how did we end up today? Because there's a couple of big points in there in terms of like the 60s, the end of the Cold War, which is a great topic. But just walk us through those seasonal changes and how we got to where we are right now.
Sure. So unlike in Europe, America never had an official state church, but we did sort of have a softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion for most of our history. As recently as the 1950s, half of all adults went to church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money. We were adding "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. It was a Christian normative, especially Protestant normative society. Then starting in the 1960s, this started to become unraveled. And Christianity went into decline in America, a decline that continues to the present day. And I divide this period of decline in America from 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And this is one thing I modified for the book. I really did try to dial in on when the positive world begins, because to me, the positive world is the first phase of Christian decline. That is to say, what I've labeled the positive world, Christianity is in decline in America. Church attendance is down. Things are not going in the right direction. Yet Christianity is still basically viewed positively.
Yeah.
To be known, right, as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian moral norms are still the basic moral norms of society, and to violate them gets you into trouble. Now, certainly, it was positive going all the way back to Plymouth, for certain. But I think that you start looking at that pre-1950s era where, again, you had this sort of soft institutionalization. Yeah. It's also positive, but I wanted to distinguish. This is the first phase of decline. Is the positive.
Yeah, which is kind of funny when you think there's actually decline, but we're calling it positive.
Right.
But in the positive, and one of the things you talk about the book is because of our fallen human nature, when things are going well, we tend to become very apathetic and we take things for granted. So even though the reality is a downward slide, we're just they're thinking, oh, everything's fine. Yeah, we got some crazy stuff in the 60s, but overall Christianity is just fine. Thanks for asking, Aaron.
Yeah. Then in 1994, we had a tipping point. We entered what I call the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014. And in the neutral world, Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not really viewed negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian morality has a certain residual impact. Then in 2014, we enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. Maybe skeptically is a better word. And, again, you could go back to the founding. The founding fathers weren't necessarily all devout Christians, right. Let's just say. Christianity was publicly held in honor. That's what's changed today. The skeptical voices are now the official voices. Being known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Quite the opposite in some cases. Christian morality is now expressly repudiated, and in fact is now seen as, in some respects, the leading threat to the new public moral order. And this has been very dislocating to American Christians and evangelicals, to say the least.
Yeah, because I think that we rested on our laurels. Of course, when you go back into the 90s and you get into the gay marriage argument, then you start to see, okay, now we're arguing over marriage. Whoever thought we would argue over marriage? But then you still had 31 states that were able to muster the votes to pass state constitutional amendments. We did it here in North Carolina. It wasn't until 2012, but you still had that potential of gathering the Christian vote and Christian normative morals back then. And so we're like, okay, hey, we fought back and we beat it. And then you go to the Supreme Court in 2014 and all of a sudden, whammo, gay marriage is the law of the land, so to speak. It's really been amazing where there's there have been some actual events that would show you, okay, that's a definite turning point. So were there some things as we look back over the last 60 years, Aaron, we're talking to Aaron Renn about his book, that it's in my hands right now, Life in the Negative World, which you can get, you can go to Aaron's website, aaronrenn.com, or just jump on Amazon and you can find it there. Were there some pivotal events in this 60-year history which really stood out to you as you were writing the book and studying all this?
Sure. I am not one of these where did it all go wrong people. People ask me, one of the questions I get is, what caused the negative world?
Yeah.
And I don't profess to know that. And I'm not even sure that there is a per se cause. I think history is a sort of contingent outworking of many complex forces. Mm-hmm. There are some important kind of signposts along the way, I'd say, however. One of them would have been the collapse of the old Protestant establishment in the 1960s. This is something that we don't even think about today. It doesn't compute for most people. We don't teach it in the history books, basically. But up until the 1960s, America had sort of been run by a hegemonic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. You might call it that, the WASP elite. And, the term WASP really specifically referred to the upper class. Mm-hmm. And they weren't all Anglo-Saxon, but they were Protestant. And this had morphed, extensively over America's history. But there had been a lot of continuity as well. So, for example, the guy who was the president of Yale University during the Vietnam War was a guy named Kingman Brewster. He was the 11th generation descendant of Elder William Brewster from the Mayflower.
Yeah.
There were members of the Addams family that were prominent well into the 20th century.
Wow.
So that's like almost 200 years, of prominence there. This group were predominantly liberal Protestants. These were not, evangelicals as we would understand the term by and large. However, Protestantism was definitely part of their identity. And so as long as these people were running society, they certainly would never have allowed a sort of anti-Protestant or anti-Christian attitude to take over. That's one of the things I'd say. So the collapse of that establishment, we can't go into this today, is really one of the seminal events in understanding the dysfunctions of America since then.
Yeah, great point.
A second one was the collapse of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War, fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Why were we adding "In God We Trust" to our money in the 50s? The Cold War. So, communism is this sort of avowedly atheist, materialist system. We're involved in essentially total full spectrum war in everything but, I guess military against the Soviet Union. And of course, we actually do have wars going on, proxy wars around the world, Vietnam. And Christianity became part of our moral defense against the Soviet Union.
No, that's when we added "under God" to the pledge, which was not there originally.
Right. Then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism, that freed society to essentially unbundle Christianity from what it meant to be a liberal, Western, democratic society. In fact, I could debate whether 1989 should be viewed as the start of the neutral world. 94, it's also an important event, I think, because a couple of things happened then. One, that's really when baby boomers were taking over leadership in society. In that, Bill Clinton, the first boomer president.
Yeah, the radicals of the 60s
right.
took over
and so,
DC.
So really, boomers was sort of a transition to boomer leadership in society. Also, 1994, one reason I picked this as the start of the neutral world, that's the year Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York. And, crime collapsed and cities came back. And that created this new, highly educated, urban, progressive demographic that became so influential. It has been so influential in America. So those are some things that definitely, played some key roles, along the way to be certain.
And you referenced this in chapter 2 when you were talking about kind of life in the positive world, which is where I got started in my Christian activism and being more of a public Christian. And we're talking to Aaron Renn, life in the negative world. And you mentioned this earlier because you mentioned the culture warriors and like, how did we play in that realm? We had the culture warriors, we had seeker sensitive people, and then we had cultural engagement. Touch on that real quick. And then I want to get into kind of the real meat of our conversation is I don't think anybody's going to argue with us, Aaron, or the premise of the book that we're in a negative world here in America. Much of the West is. I think the big question, the big mystery, even for us as mature Christians, but especially for our children and grandchildren is all right. And the scriptures talk about this. I might start a PhD this fall, and my focus is going to be on exilic living in exile. Because you talk about this in the book, that Christianity actually has within itself all the tools we need to deal with living out our faith in a negative world, because that's where it got started anyway. But talk real quickly, just because I want people to be able to self-identify kind of who they were in the positive world. And then we're going to chuck that because that no longer exists. We're in the negative world. Then we'll talk about how do we move forward. But the culture warriors, seeker sensitivity, and cultural engagement, just real quick.
Yeah, so I laid out the three worlds model. Then I say, what were the ways that the evangelical world responded to this decline? And to some extent, evangelicalism, as we understand it today, is a product of this decline. Because if you go back to the 1950s, it was really the mainline denominations that dominated the American religious landscape. And they started losing adherents, and they're still losing adherents. They were never able to figure out what to do. Evangelicalism had superior adaptability. And so it filled the vacuum left behind by the retreat of the mainlines. And there were essentially 3 evangelical strategies that I identified, 2 from the positive world, 1 from the neutral world. In the positive world, we had culture war and seeker sensitivity. In the neutral world, we had cultural engagement. So the culture war we get, it's the religious right, it's Jerry Falwell, it's Pat Robertson. The very name of the paradigmatic organization of the culture war, moral majority, speaks to a positive world. It was at least plausible to claim, Christians represented a majority. It might not have been true even then, but it was at least a plausible claim. Nobody would ever create an organization called that today. And their response was, hey, we don't like the way the world is going, so we're going to mobilize politically to fight back and take back the country. And there was this big shift in which evangelicals went from primarily being Democrats to primarily being Republicans during the 1980s.
That's how Reagan got elected. One of the reasons he got elected. Yeah,
it became very essentially aligned, two-lined in my opinion, but very aligned with the Republican Party, and became essentially the largest, most important voting bloc in the Republican Party. And of course, the religious right is still with us today.
Yeah.
The seeker sensitives also got started in the 1970s, pioneered by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, Rick Warren at Saddleback Church in the very early 80s. And these people saw the folks weren't attending church. And so their response is, well, why don't we create a church they'll attend? So the origin story of Willow Creek is that Bill Hybels went door to door in suburban Chicago, asking people why they didn't go to church. And as he said, I got an earful. So it's like, okay, I'm going to design a church I want to go to. We're going to get rid of all these denominational distinctives, all these stodgy hymns and robes. We're going to have contemporary music. It's going to be more informal, topical therapeutic sermons, all that stuff. And it was an enormous success. And this became essentially what we now know as the essentially non-denominational suburban megachurch, which is in some respects the evangelical mainstream today.
Sure. Yep.
And, there's many, many, many types of these. They're not all exactly the same, but they sort of have that sort of same vibe. And then in the neutral world in the 1990s, we saw the emergence of a third strategy I call cultural engagement. There are a couple ways we can conceptualize it. One is as a seeker sensitivity for the cities. Hybels and Rick Warren were able to reach that emerging baby boomer suburbia. That was really a suburban movement. As the cities came back, people like Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York, they figured out how to reach the cities, how to reach college towns. Yep. The emerging church would have been a movement you would put very much in this, almost an entirely urban educated movement, very conversational. Some people refer to it as the emerging church conversation. And so that was sort of a seeker sense. That's like one way to think of it. The other way to think of it is the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people there all the time, they're like, why don't we take advantage of this pluralistic public square to sit down and have a conversation with people and just have a dialogue? And we believe we can articulate Christianity in a compelling way. And of course, this was also very successful and still is. So all of these are still with us today. And I think they all got some important things right if the sort of model on which they were based is now, fundamentally shifted. So the question is, what is the evangelical strategy for the negative world? And the reality is there hasn't been one. The only person I know who really put out a strategy for the negative world is Rod Dreher with his Benedict option, which he articulated in the book of the same name in 2017. Evangelicals, by and large, rejected the Benedict option. For example, Christianity Today magazine wrote and commissioned 4 people to give their opinion on the book. All 4 of them had significant critiques of the book.
Wow.
And
did he write Live Not by Lies after that?
Yes.
Okay.
And it sold much better. Although he now says today that Benedict option is now making a comeback. That's the book people want to talk to him about, is the Benedict option. And so I do think I think he made some mistakes in reaching an evangelical audience. He's not an evangelical. He'd be the first person to tell you, I don't know anything about the evangelical world. Featuring a monastery prominently and like talking about monasticism, that's not going to resonate, those sorts of things.
No.
But even so, even once you make an adjustment for those things, the reality is that, I think that evangelicals were kind of in a state of denial. And I think there's much less of a state of denial today, but there's
Agreed.
still a lot of uncertainty about what to do. And honestly, it is an uncertain time. It's not as easy today to figure out what to do.
No, not at all, which is why it's so important to have this conversation, which is why it's so important. And I continue to push people to read books like yours, Aaron, Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture, because we are really going back to our roots, whether you like it or not. Living as a church in exile, there really is no country or kingdom on this planet where we should fit in, and nor should you expect it ever to be positive towards Christianity. And if it is positive towards Christianity, perhaps Christianity is not being what it was designed to be, because there's a lot of aspects about the truth of God's word, as you know, that culture in general, the vast majority of people are going to have a problem with. That's why they don't like the Bible, because it cuts against pretty much every grain that's out there. And so I think people I agree with you. I think most of us know, yep, we're there. We live in a negative world. The big question is, what do you do? Which is why you see kind of this desperation. And I'm glad you mentioned we tied ourselves perhaps too much to the Republican Party. You see such desperation with presidential elections. So when Trump comes in and he says, I'm gonna nominate conservative judges, then of course they turn around and overturn Roe versus Wade. And everybody's like, okay, boom, baby, we're back. And then he loses by hook or by crook. That's not the point of the show. And then you get Biden, and now we can get Trump back. And so there's so much reliance on the system, on politics, on who's in the White House. And people still talk about, and this gets me in trouble at homeschool conventions, and I can see it on people's faces. I'm like, you guys gotta quit thinking about saving America. You can't save America per se. There's things that we can do that would be good for our neighbor. Like Jeremiah says, we should seek the welfare of the city. But if you think you're going to turn the city back to, Aaron, your point, to the positive world, you're not. And scripture would confirm that the overall trajectory of life on earth is down until Christ comes back. So that you just kind of have to accept that. But like you mentioned, the moral majority, those days are over. We're in the moral minority. And when you bring it up, the morality, the ethics of Christianity, you get canceled. And so now here we are, which is one of the things I love. I mean, I'm holding Aaron's book in my hand. Okay, so you can get through looking to how did we get to where we're at is 50 pages. But the rest of the book, Aaron, is, okay, to your point, what's the road forward, which is actually the subtitle in this particular chapter I'm looking at. What's the road forward? How do we do this? And what's our goal here? So when you're writing this book, Aaron, we all agree with you. We're in the negative world now. But what should be our goals as we move forward? Clearly, we're all going to agree, evangelism, the Great Commission. But what should we even be after as the minority here in the great land of America?
Right. Well, I'm very struck by the New Testament, and I got to be a little careful here because I always like to tell people, I am not a theologian or a pastor or a Bible scholar, so I don't profess to be an authoritative interpreter of scripture. I'm really operating in the kind of the genres of cultural criticism, if you will, and bringing my management consulting background. This is sort of a strategy document, if you will. But I'm really struck. I read the letters of Paul one time and went through all of them and wrote down every single command he issued, and I divided them into categories. Like, what is he talking about in these commands? Are there general themes? And there were a bunch of them. But the two biggest ones were personal holiness and unity in the church. Yeah, and he actually had remarkably little to say about the world outside of the church.
Yep.
And to the extent that he did, it was mostly about how to accommodate yourself to it with the least amount of disruption. Pay taxes to whom taxes are due. So far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Overwhelmingly, he was concerned with things like false teaching. We want to hold, although this is not Paul, hold fast to the truth once for all, delivered to the saints. So retaining the truth of the gospel and not falling into various errors, very important. Secondly, again, it was about being unified in the church and keeping sin out of the church. You'd read a book like, 1 Corinthians. And again, a lot of it was about, how do we live together as this new form of community, the church? Now, I think you can take that too far and become kind of Anabaptist.
Sure.
There. I think and I
Just pull out.
quote from the book of Ecclesiastes, where there's a time to kill, there's a time to heal. There's a time to build up, there's a time to tear down. I think we like to create this idea that history is a tableau and everything that we do is like the same, right? That there's a sort of, we should have the same approach, the same goals, throughout time, when in fact circumstances vary widely.
Sure.
In some cases, you're in a Christian society in which you can then do certain things. And other times you're like a very small minority in a hostile society, and you could do others. So as Rome Christianized, certainly the church became more expansive in what it aspired to do. But when it was this minority, they really weren't trying to, save the Roman Empire, right?
Wasn't even an option.
Right, wasn't an option. That's just a good way to get yourself killed. Now, they weren't operating in fear. It wasn't like, hey, Paul never went looking for trouble. Trouble went looking for him.
That's right.
And he got in trouble because he was preaching the gospel, right? He didn't get in trouble because he was just being a jerk for all sorts of other things. He tried to be polite to the different governors and people of that nature. But preaching the gospel got him in trouble. Like, I'm not going to shut up about that.
And so that's point. Even before that, to your point, because there is a time and a place, and Paul did. Hey, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. Oh, yeah. So all the Roman centurions, all the soldiers, are like, oh, okay, crap.
Yeah.
No. Different tactic. Plan B. Now we have to protect this guy, and he appeals to Caesar, which is how God's going to get him to Rome. And so there are times when Paul utilizes his citizenship, but it's rare. And even in Jesus and the announcement of Jesus, when you're in Mark and when you're in Luke and you're talking about Jesus, Lord and Savior, King, the gospel is, whether you like it or not, it's inherently political, especially in the age in which it came out, because Caesar had taken all the same titles and he was the Savior of the world and he was the King and he was the Lord. And it was his image on the coin, as opposed to the image of God that's imprinted on everybody. So they walked into a political nightmare, but they knew you're not going to change Rome, which is why the Pharisees were upset. Okay, if you're the Messiah, you're going to kick some butt. We're going to take over. We're going to reestablish Jerusalem as the center of the world. Rome's going to get devastated and we'll be back on top, baby. And that wasn't the point at all. They misunderstood what the scriptures had taught. And so I think that for a lot of us, we need to hey, we're right back to the first century, friends. And you got to accept that. And then go to this question we're having now, Aaron, is what do we do as we move forward, accepting this is our lot in America right now?
Sure. Well, I didn't, I don't profess to have the 50-point plan, for exactly what to do. But what I try to do is give some starter ideas across three dimensions: the personal, the institutional, and the missional. The personal, like how should we live as individuals and families? Institutional, how should our churches, ministries, businesses, other organizations structure and adapt? And then missional, how should we engage culturally, politically, carry out the Great Commission, do evangelism? And there are three themes I'd highlight out of that. I don't have time to go through it all, but the three things I'd highlight, one of them is this posture of exploration. And again, Bill, if you think about Bill Hybels, what he did in the 70s was sort of a business school strategy approach. He went and did some market research. Right. He found the gap in the market. He designed, a product to appeal, and it was very successful. And I don't think that's what we can do today. We're in a more fundamentally unknown, uncertain, rapidly changing thing. It's not just about doing some customer research and asking people why they don't go to church. So, to me, it's like we have to be much more comfortable in the unknown, in walking by faith rather than by sight. And the example I give in the Bible is the Israelites who are about to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And this generation had known nothing but the wilderness, and maybe it wasn't the greatest, but it was very familiar. And they just had to go outside every morning and collect their manna. Right? They had food every day; they were provided for. Now they're going into this place they've never seen. And they've been promised it, but they know it's full of people who aren't going to give it up without a fight. And there's this scene in Joshua where he's telling them, you're going to cross the Jordan River, follow the ark, that is to say God's presence, because you have not been this way before. And that's us. We have not been this way before.
That's right.
So it's uncertain for us. I think a second is to adopt the minority mindset and to focus I say rebalance away from trying to be relevant and trying to be transformational towards being a counterculture. We're always trying to be relevant. Seeker sensitivity and a lot of the urban church, like, let's be relevant to the culture. Let's try to speak to the concerns of the people. And there's some of that we can keep doing. And again, the transformation, the culture war, we're going to transform society through politics. What we've neglected, I think, to some extent, is the strength of our own community. And that's really the obsession of the New Testament. When you are a minority, go back to the 50s. There's prayer and Bible reading in schools.
Right.
There's a lot that's reinforcing in the mainstream institutions of society the Christian culture. It's not per se Christian government and things of that nature, but there's a certain reinforcement, or at least not too much conflict in some cases.
Right.
Now you're talking about significant conflicts. You say your kids to school today, you're not going to get the 10 Commandments read to them in class. You're not going to have a prayer. You're going to have something very much entirely.
You'll have a hard time even including your faith in your valedictorian speech. I helped a young girl and her mom here just a couple of years ago that the principal was like, "Oh, you can't include that." And they reached out to me and I'm like, well, actually the law is still on your side. The whole nother story. But the thing and by the way, Aaron, getting into the meat of this book, Life in the Negative World, as we look at moving forward and talking about personal and institutional and missional, it was very, I just want you to know this. I'm a mature Christian. I'm a well-studied Christian. I'm a well-educated Christian. It was very convicting. You're going to get into some things in here, like become excellent, become resilient. And as you look at, for years, and I've used this line for years. Hey, it's easy to point the white hot spotlight of judgment at the culture, but do we have the guts to turn around and point it at ourselves? So as we look at everything that's wrong with the culture and all its moral madness, stop for a second. Don't leave your driveway. Look at your own life, your own heart, your own thought life, what you do with your free time, what you do when nobody's watching. And that's that point that we have to shore up who we are as believers. Judgment begins in our house. It doesn't begin out there. And that's where this was so important to kind of go, okay, since we can't change the culture, maybe we need to spend a little time making sure we've been changed enough as we follow Christ.
Right. I mean, if you think about like the 1950s, when it was sort of semi-expected that people go to church,
right,
you basically have to have a place in the pews for everybody. Right. You can't make too many demands. And one of the things about being a minority is it actually frees us to say, okay, what is actually required to live as a Christian? Amen. And if you read a book like Ephesians, and it's 3 chapters of like command after command. Here's how you live. If you read like the Didache, which is the oldest church catechism, tons and tons of commands. And it's like there is like a high bar for what it means to live as a Christian. And that doesn't mean that we have to, again, we don't clean up our act and then we can come to church. We come to church and then,
right,
we're transformed by the Holy Spirit.
That's right.
But nevertheless, this idea that, we're sort of basically very similar to every other middle or upper middle class person who sort of has their life put together by the standards of the world. Our lives aren't that different. That's, I think that's untenable, and I think we can set a higher standard for what we expect. And I think we need to, raise the standards for ourselves.
Yes.
Which again, when you have this, when everybody is sort of expected to quote unquote be a Christian, then you kind of have to set a low bar.
Right.
But now that it's different, we can say, okay, great. And and the truth is, Jesus didn't try to make it easy to follow him.
No.
He tried to make it hard in some ways.
And the crowds got smaller.
Yeah, the crowd we're going to lose some people here. And so I think we can think more about that. More about the discipleship. Again, strengthening our own communities so that we have something distinct to invite people in. And then those communities themselves can be attractional to people. Just as, 200-300 years after Christianity, the lives that the Christians led were very attractive to pagans. And they're like, wow, it was a very attractive lifestyle. Julian the Apostate wrote a famous letter talking about complaining about, how people are looking to them because they take care of, the poor, and they give each other good funerals. And like he goes through this, list of a few things that they do. And like, well, we're not
hard to compete.
hard to compete. We got to do a better job. Like
Yeah.
if we're going to have a paganism here, we have to give an attractive lifestyle. And so
Yeah,
it won't
such
be
a
the
great
same thing.
point.
It won't be funerals today. But can we live in a way that's distinct enough from the world that people see that and they're like, wow, what do they
Yeah.
got going?
Because the one thing that hasn't changed about the world is based on Romans chapter 1, there's no such thing as an atheist. Everybody knows
Right.
God exists. They just take a position on it. And they all have a hole that they're trying to fill. And the human condition hasn't changed in 6,000 years. And so that's the same. You got to remember that people are still seeking. They're still searching. They're still hurting. They're still looking for meaning. They're still looking for acceptance and love and affirmation. And so we still have the answer that we were given when Christ walked the planet. And that's awesome. We got to reassure ourselves of that. You mentioned the word subculture, Aaron. Again, we're talking to Aaron Renn, Life in the Negative World. You can get it at Aaron's website, aaronrenn.com, or you can grab it on Amazon's incredible book, an easy read. I read it in probably 4 or 5 days. Captivating, really thought-provoking. So it's an excellent book that you need to get. You mentioned the word subculture. But you also mentioned the Anabaptists. Like, we're not calling for people to move to Pennsylvania and join the Amish,
Right.
and just back ourselves out of everything. But one of the central themes on the second half of the book is institutional. So talk about that, because institutionalism and us not being out there. Here's an example. Our oldest son, Hayden, who's married now, lives in San Francisco. He's in the gaming industry. So first of all, when he wanted to go into the gaming industry, there was a certain reaction amongst our conservative Christian friends, like, "Ooh, he's going to go work for the devil." And then just to sprinkle some pixie dust on top, then he's going to move to San Francisco, and everybody's like, "Oh my gosh, Steve, why would he want to move to San Francisco, the land of fruits and nuts out there? What's the point of that?" And I'd always tell him, Aaron, I'd say, "You know what? You remind me of somebody." I love to interrupt. I'm like, "You remind me of somebody." "What?" "Yeah, you remind me of somebody." "Who?" "You remind me of Jonah." "You remind me of Jonah because he was ready for Nineveh." "I'm not going to Nineveh. Who cares about those people? Dirtbags. They don't deserve any grace. I'm not going there." But we need to be in the institutions and have an influence in the world, not to pull away from it. But you speak to this so beautifully in Life in the Negative World, that where's the excellence in Christian performance and in Christian, not movies, which we talked about, but in the business world, in the world of arts, in the world of science, that we need to be encouraging our kids, the ones that are capable of that, get in. Don't get out, get in. Please speak to that, because I think it's a big deal.
Well, there are a couple of different aspects of that. First is, evangelicals need to elevate our game in terms of excellence.
Amen.
And I was inspired, of course, by the famous book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll, the Notre Dame historian. The scandal being evangelicals don't seem to have a mind. He was pretty brutal towards, calling it anti-intellectual, a number of things. And the truth of the matter is, even kind of conservative evangelicals who are educated tend to look to Catholic intellectuals to tell them about the world very often. It's very complicated. I can't go into it all now, but evangelicalism was kind of a middle class movement, and it never really had the sort of institutional, intellectual, other orientations towards sort of those domains. So that's one thing. Another part of excellence is economist Tyler Cowen wrote a book called Average is Over. The middle class is getting hollowed out. You're either moving up into sort of upper middle class, getting more affluent, or you're becoming poorer, you're becoming proletarianized. And so there's more and more superstar effects, where a Taylor Swift makes all the money, and then there's, a few people under her, but then most people who are trying to make a living are getting ramen noodle money. And that's kind of the world we're living in. There isn't this broad middle anymore. And so just as a paradigm of life, the world is kind of bifurcating a little bit. And so we need to really elevate our game. Then when it comes to the institutions, like moving into sort of elite domains of society, I think what we ought to be doing is, again, I think people ought to be intentional about where they go.
Yeah.
And so by that, I mean, like, it used to be, when I graduated from college, you want to get a job. Like, if you're a Christian guy graduating from college, it didn't matter where you went to work because, it was going to be fine there. Well, now there are certain professions that may have more pressures than others. Mm-hmm. And, in that, you're going to be faced with is this going to work for my conscience? Is this going to work for my personality?
That's a great point.
Because there's a lot of things about it. So some people are very well suited to go to work in technology in San Francisco. They should be there. They shouldn't be afraid to go there. Other people, it's kind of a bad choice. So
Right.
again, I don't think there's a one size fits all, but
I
I think it's one of these things where we have to consider it intentionally. And again, I think you get the right point. The other thing is we can't just run away and I'll go start homesteading, back in the mountains somewhere. It's always interesting to look at, the homesteading movement, and it's inspirational to watch all the social media influencers, and there's huge number. I mean, the New York Times writes about them, and my wife loves watching the trad wives who do all the stuff. And I love the hunter gatherer types who are out there, it's great stuff, but that's going to be like a niche at best. And so we have to think about, we can't just have this mentality of we're just going to run away. Because running away is not going to solve all our problems.
No, and it's not loving your neighbor either. And if you don't love your neighbor, you're violating the love of God. That's why Jesus boils the whole commandments down to a complex answer: love the Lord your God with thy heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself, which actually satisfies all the laws in the Old Testament, especially the 10 commandments. They all get satisfied in that one particular answer, which was brilliant, of course. Speak real quick, and then I know we're done. Just kind of this, number one, missional, having this missional mindset. What is our mission here? And then number two, should we be, is it so off to work I go? Are we Eeyores? We're never going to make it. This is just so depressing. Or should we be actually excited and almost like an Esther-esque type mindset that, hey, you know what? It's not an accident that I'm a mature Christian for such a time as this. So this is actually an incredible opportunity as America has gotten darker for the gospel and for the church to be all the more bright. But missional, and then just a word of encouragement as we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the last things I love about the Bible is it's very realistic about the human condition. It's one of the most realistic books out there. At the same time, it's a book that's full of hope. And so I feel the same way. I think we need to be clear-eyed and realistic about the situation in America. But I do not believe Christianity is having a going out of business sale in the USA.
Amen. Well said.
I don't think it's going to become Europe. I think there are going to be substantial numbers of Christians in America for a very long time to come. And there is a sense, right, that today, God didn't make a mistake when he put us here. And there is, in a sense, more opportunity. There's more opportunity to earn rewards than maybe people who had like the sunny skies, in the 1950s could have. And so I think, it's something to make sure there's hope, clear-eyed realism combined with hope. And certainly I think the key is to avoid the fatalistic assumption that Christianity is simply going to just disappear in America. I don't believe that's going to be the case.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And you don't win any Medal of Honors in boot camp. You actually have to be in war to get those kinds of rewards. And again, that's why I love the realization in life in the negative world. Okay, this is where we're at. Here's what's happened. I think we all agree with that. And then the big question that we're all wrestling with is, where do we go from here? And I think Life in the Negative World, Aaron, does a great job of setting that conversation up and giving us some tools, and very convicting in many ways about how now shall we live? That's the big question that we're dealing with. And that's why I think this is just a great blessing and such a great book, Life in the Negative World. You can get it at Aaron's website, Aaron Renn, that's 2 N's, AaronRenn.com. Of course, you can get it on Amazon, and get this, to read this and consider this, and share the podcast and share the video with other Christians, because we need to be sober-minded about where we're at, because this is the world that we live in now. And then we need to learn, and then we need to pass that on to our children and grandchildren, which is why I love teaching in the classroom so much. But Aaron, it's been great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the time that you put into this book and the time you're putting into the kingdom. It's really been a great blessing.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.